That's, oh, okay. Sorry. In my speech, I'll talk about three things. First, in response to the Prime Minister, is the concept of repayment of loan something that is, repayment of debt or loan something that is necessarily bad in of itself. Second, why do we think the proposal from side government is one that is discriminatory in nature, that unfairly targets a fraction of society? And third, why do we think these types of individuals, the lower income bracket group, are the individuals that need credit the most, and how is it that they can benefit their lives, and how is it that their side will need further disadvantages? First, the idea of repayment of debt and loans. So I think primarily we have to recognize that every individual, no matter what bracket income you exist in, you always work towards achieving money to do something with that money. So it could be that you work very hard to get money for you to buy a car, buy a house, invest in something, whatever not. The concept of loans or credit in of itself is actually similar to the comparative, which is, I'm assuming what they want, that you work and get the money instead. Because the end goal of both is that you get money to pay for something. With regards to loan, at the very minimum, you will get this benefit beforehand. Meaning to say, today you will get the car, today you will get the house, today you get to go to this whatever place that you want to go and get, I don't know, for instance, right? At the very minimum, you get to reap the benefits of all of the things right now, as opposed to waiting for age to set in later on of that possibility happening in of itself. Under both worlds, you have to pay for something, essentially, right? So if the idea is that you can never pay, it's something that cannot work, because the comparative that they have to defend is that these individuals would be able to get any form of money to do anything at all. But the second level to this is the harms that they talked about. The harms is that it will unfairly be punitive upon banks, because if banks to give out all this money and later these individuals can't pay back, bailouts will happen, and then that is bad. We think this is first uncomparative as to what actually happens in status quo. Banks on their own are always incentivized to give money to individuals that are always capable of paying back. How do they do this? They have to take in stringent background checks upon this individual to see as to this individual's financial capacity, financial spending in the past, did the person have any debts, and then only they'll offer a particular amount towards the individual. Meaning to say, if the individual comes to them and says, I want to get this money to buy a BMW, but the person can't probably afford a BMW and can never pay back based on the bank's calculation, they will never give them to begin with. But even if they were to, let's say they were to give this money towards that, we think like banks are incentivized after the 2008 crisis that they would want your money as opposed to your assets, right? Because if they take all your houses and there's a result of the default, if the asset prices of it go completely crash, they can't get their money to begin with. But if they are completely negligent in doing so, and as a result of that, the bank goes bankrupt and we have to bail them out, we will not bail them out if it's completely on these people's individuals and their fault, because these are the banks who did not carry out stringent process to begin with. We can't give them a get out of jail card all the time, right? And that's the conclusion for the first thing, is that we think repayment of debt and loan is something that status quo in of itself inherently already has with regards to individuals and working life. We don't think there's an inherent problem with that. But second, why do we think this is a form of discrimination? Note that the Prime Minister's characterization to why we should target this particular group is that misfortunes can happen, example, accidents, and etc. You need a lot of money. This misfortune is something that's so arbitrary, happens to any person with regards to any bracket that you would exist in. Even if you're on the upper bracket, if you are involved in an accident, it is so bad that you can't pay money for it, we think you can also affect those individuals. But let's recontextualize the rationality or the characteristics of this lower income group of people. These are individuals that more often not spend they work 2 to 3 jobs, right? These are individuals that are extremely hardworking, people who get food stamps because they want to save as much money as possible, right? These are people who are capable of having rationality as to how is it they want to save money and how they want to use money. These are also individuals that are in this situation because of circumstances that they can't avoid. It's either that you're born in an extremely poor family, you can't reap off any inheritance from these individuals, or you're a minority in a particular country, for example, an Indian in Malaysia or an African American in the United States, that makes it difficult for you to access benefits and access job opportunities, that all of this results in a position that they are in today, right? The conclusion of this is supposed to say that you can't punitively assume that these people are all irrational and unable to pay back. Sit down, because what is the harms through it? There are 3 harms the moment the state enacts these policies. First, you are inevitably trapping them within this cycle that they already exist in. You're further punishing the individuals for the birth lottery that they exist in, that they're unable to get any form of income of their race or etc. And then you tell them that you cannot get out of this birth lottery. The state on their side is doing absolutely nothing to help these individuals. At least when the individual wants to try themselves to get out of the pile that they are in, the state further pulls them back down and say, you can't take any credit, you have to work in this horrible environment for you to get out yourself. But the second harm, sit down, is that you pass social judgments. This policy essentially says everyone below this bracket income cannot spend money rationally, they can't think for themselves, and this is a horrible stigma to place about this individual, because this translates to how people treat them, as to whether or not these people will be trusted to begin job opportunities and etc. The comparatives is that we are okay with us giving them these opportunities to credit, because the problem with Prime Minister wasn't necessarily that these poor people are bad, is that the banks are the ones that are punitive and predatory in lending. We are fine with things like making sure there's absolutely no predatory lending. We are fine with clamping down on banks that seriously give out high interest rates. We are okay with making sure that individuals get perfect information before they sign a contract when it comes to loans and etc. All of these things can be regulated. All he has to do is the state has to work a lot more, as opposed to shifting the blame and further punishing these poor individuals. I think that's a bad example to the other side. Closing.
Can you explain guaranteed to me why the loans that they get will be used for positive beneficial things?
Okay, oh my God. Okay, it doesn't matter if they use it for positive beneficial thing, but we'll assume to the best extent that these individuals, given the situation, they would. But even if they do not use it for positive things, at the very minimum, if they are able to pay back their loans with regards to the rates they're taking in, we're perfectly fine with that. But second, why is it that this group of individuals will need the credit the most? If you talk about these types of individuals, these are the individuals that will need things like logistics, right? They need a car to travel to work, TV, a laptop to be as relevant as possible into this world. In the moment you strip them of loans, they can't access all of these things, because these things are seen as something that's not absolutely necessity, but they are necessary for you to travel to work, for you to have to work as part-time Uber and etc. But second, for you to get education and skills. If you can get a loan, you can further your education, and you can also further your skills in terms of you learning culinary, learning sewing, for you advancing education. These are all things that happen because you don't have money to begin with in capital. That's why you take loan, for you to get this opportunity. It's important for these individuals, for them to aspire to be something greater than what they already are. That's the only way individuals can maybe move out to a different city, for them to get a better job opportunity, considering the situation that they are in right now. The comparative is that people still need money. They will find money from any and all opportunities that extremely dodgy, sharp loans, things that you absolutely can't regulate. All of these things will further hamper these poorer individuals, which is why we think it's perfectly fine for us to not punish these people of lower income group, further instead help them, and we think credit loans help them. Oh shit. Trying to fix this. A number of things in my speech. Firstly, why the states will be right in doing this. Secondly, why we think we can't just rely on fixing the system in this debate. Thirdly, I'm going to talk about what's economically better for these people in terms of getting themselves economically viable,
I think that's pretty much what opposition was hanging on in this debate, right? Lots of stuff in here. I'll try to be as fast as possible. On the first issue, why states shouldn't ban this, two things are important here. Firstly, I think states are the only people who are able to protect many of these individuals, are able to get this funding. I think what was missing in open opposition is the key nuance we brought to you from PM, that for the vast majority of these people, they don't have the stability and they don't have the flowing income to be able to cope with any at the point in which any of these disasters happen. That differentiates them for the vast majority of people that earn above the national average, because it means you're earning at a point in which you're still able to stomach any response to many of these costings, and it won't cost you as much as possible as what you would have if you're someone who's unable to cope with many of these things. But I think what is important here is that people aren't just spending money on the wisest thing possible, because if Vinod had taken my POI, he would have engaged with the fact that for the vast majority of these people, right, who are within this class economically, they are unable to do things like spend money on real estate in large scale, or do things like invest wisely in many instances, because in many cases they are trapped within the amount of expenditure that they can get in status quo. So I'm not sure what that credit card is going to, like what use that credit card is going to be to that person. I will explain more on this later. But the point here is that often what you get is that you get a coercion of social pressures and advertising. That means that you're coerced into buying every single thing. If you have a credit card in your hand, the first thing you want to buy is the latest iPhone in many instances, or you want to spend on your shoes, on your clothing, and many of these things that aren't necessities for the vast majority of people. That's why in status quo, many people buy cars before they buy houses, even though your car isn't as important to you as when you're able to have a shelter or something that might be able to be better for you in status quo. I don't think the vast majority of poor people in these instances are the best financial calculators in status quo. If not, literally that profession won't exist anymore. Those are the amount of people that often spend money unwisely, are unable to take into calculation how they ought to spend money in many instances. I'm not making a general statement that all poor people can't spend money. My point here is that for the vast majority of people, they are unable to spend this money in the best way possible because they are constrained by what they can actually spend money on in this debate. But secondly, is the social pressure that you need to buy a house. You must get a house no matter how much that's not the best thing for you in status quo. The reasons why we think this is bad is twofold. Firstly, in many instances, it's more expensive for you when you get that house because you now need to pay for the continuous payment as well as the credit that you're paying on top of that payment in many cases. And the very fact that your national income is that low means that the amount of money you pay frequently makes it that you pay longer and you just pay for way more interest than you would have actually paid if you were sticking with your rent in status quo. That's what you get on this side, right? But secondly, is that it keeps you stagnant in one place, right? For the vast majority of these people that are still gaining social mobility, you ought to be able to move off to many places in status quo. That means you ought to be able to chase job opportunities as opposed to getting a house that sticks you in one place where you can't actually gain social mobility in status quo. And note that for the vast majority of these people, they're not likely to buy a house in KL or in many places that are actually economically well-to-do because they are just gentrified and they're unable to buy houses in many of these places. That means where you get your houses are in areas where you don't have the best of economic opportunities, and that's the sort of decision that is enforced by society that you need a house and you need to spend money on that house. And that's what many of these people do. I think at the point in which the state does this is that it allows people to make a decision on their own, because in state school that decision isn't one that they are actually making, but they're giving into the impulse of society and coercion that you get in state school. This means sit down, right? But secondly is the fact that they spend money on things like maybe in the best case startups and businesses that you get in status quo. But for the vast majority of these people, these things fail and you're unable to stomach the cost. If you're someone who is able to get that amount, like a large sum of money above the national average, you're perhaps more likely to be responsive to many crises that would happen, or if your business should fail. But what's important here and was missing in Vinod's speech is that at the point in which you fail, it is the state that has to take care of you when you file for bankruptcy, be it Chapter 11 or Chapter 9 bankruptcy. That means that either other businesses don't get their money back because the state is able to excuse you from paying back all the sum of money that you're able to pay back in many instances, or it just means that you stop business from able to get money as fast as possible because you're liquidating slowly in many instances. That means that people's society still feels the brunt of your impulsive spending in status quo. But secondly, it's way worse than this when it comes to things like housing, because when you have mortgages and people can't pay off, you're literally risking an economic crisis in this debate. Let's respond to this stuff about why not just fix the system in this debate. I'll do that before I take a POI because I don't want any POI that asks the same thing, right? Firstly, three things here. Firstly, I think these institutions often are built to beat regulations regardless of what happens. You can get multiple credit cards cards. You can get low collaterals from banks. You can get financial risk done by many of these institutions because they believe that you'll be able to bail them out in status quo from precedents, right? And even if you take Vinod's idea that we're not going to bail them out, then you're literally putting all of society at the brunt of one person's impulsive mistake or few people's impulsive mistakes in status quo. I'm not sure why it is worse for you to ban these things than for you to have an economic crisis and not fix it on your side of the house. I think that is important. If you don't fix it, it's worse. If you fix it, you're spending money on these things, and that's why the state has a duty to do this. But secondly, is that if your regulations are going to be as perfect as you want them to, taking closing, if your regulations are going to be as perfect as you want them to be on this side of the house, then it is a lot closer to a ban on this side. Exclude many of these poor people by definition. If you make it as perfect as possible, then at best maybe we're excluding them from getting some form of money. I think that's a hit we're willing to take in this debate, because fixed regulations and perfect regulations are almost just as good as a ban on this side of the house. But thirdly, is that regulations are, and this is important, only responsive, right? That means you need to wait for something to happen before you know what's wrong and then fix it. That means you're always going to be chasing the game and unable to stop these problems from happening before they actually happen. Closing. Allow poor people to vote in elections. There are many other considerations when it comes to voting. You're voting for what's in your best interest. That's quite different from this. I think you need to have some substantive stuff where I can respond to that. Don't give me that cryptic POI, right? And lastly, what's best economically for people? Firstly, I think when you spend within your means, you're spending based on what you can afford. No certain status quo and the sort of investments you do are things that are within your capacity, right? I think that is fine. You might not jump to like being a millionaire in the next 5 years, but note that for the vast majority of people, that wonderful story of a success story from a loan is often scarce. Not every single person is able to have that success story. For the vast majority of people, that's a lie. And that's what you're willing to take in this debate, right? But secondly, is the fact that when it comes to credit spending, it's often seen as an excess that you can spend extra. That means it's either the case that you're using your credit card to buy things that are excesses, or you're getting a loan and feeling that that frees up all of your income for you to spend on excesses. But ultimately, when you get credits and you're spending credits, often it's seen as a way for you to for you to cushion your excess spending in status quo, and that means that people often spend it in this way. That means they're stuck in a circle where they have to continuously pay for one loan by using another loan and use different credit cards to be able to cope in status quo. The last thing they said about stigma, right? So firstly, I think the stigmas already exist, right? But if this stigma is true, then your bad loans that you want to talk about just aren't true, because people won't give them money because they feel they can't get money at all. We're fine with that. Don't get loans. Stay within your means. Extremely proud to propose.
One of the most surprising things that my dad has ever said to me was that growing up poor, being poor is more expensive than being rich. I was surprised, right? And I was asking why. He told me that for 20 years of his life, he paid rent to a landlord who is using his rent to pay off the mortgage on the house. And at the end of 20 years, he owns nothing. Now a bank gives him money to own a house, and he's paying to own a house in the future to have an asset, right? We think that is something that that the government bench is not cognizant of. That sometimes poor people are stuck in the poverty trap. Not giving those financial assistance is going to make things worse for them. We think OG's case is based on 4 assumptions. Number 1, poor people will always spend irrationally and buy things they don't need. Number 2, if they default, somehow the economy will crash, the banks will have to be bailed out like in 2008. Government will have to pick up the bill for all those poor individuals because obviously they can't pay back themselves, and predatory loan is an inherent flaw. We already showed you through our case why predatory loan is not a problem, can be regulated. We can even offer microfinance like it's done in Bangladesh, in India. But we've also shown you the social discrimination aspect that's never been tackled. I'll deal with the rest. Firstly, what exactly do poor people spend on? We think government is generalizing them. They'll buy a Maserati, they'll buy an iPhone, as opposed to things that we often see poor people buy, like flats, small apartments, right? Just a bike to be able to go to work. We think all those things are also things they need loan to buy. Even the richest person I know, the middle class person that I know, cannot even bring cash to buy a house. Why do you think a poor person must be held to a higher standard when they buy a house? They must force them to save up first. But secondly, to prove to you that they want to ban, this decision, they must prove that everyone will make the same bad decision. To the extent that we prove to you there are a lot of people who don't make those bad decisions, then it must not be a ban instead. Why? For example, just because some Muslims are terrorists and not all Muslims are terrorists, and therefore we don't impose a travel ban on them, because we recognize that some Muslims that travel for legitimate means, this is the exact principle that we're applying here. But number three, big brands don't advertise in your pasar malam, right? They advertise in the gardens because they know which people want to buy from them. So we don't think that this is what poor people buy. But fourth, even if some subscribe to that lifestyle, sure, that's their right as long as they think they can pay. And the financial provider, the bank thinks that they can pay after looking at their credit rating. We don't think that poor people are any less rational compared to a rich individual. And Vino has even showed you how they are more frugal and money-minded because they grew up in the poor environment. Then government say, oh, but you can't pay back because you have low income. But that's the same as a middle-class individual. Because your loan is proportionate to your income. So the middle-class individual is likely to default as well. We don't think there's any difference there. To the extent that we allow them to borrow money, we should also allow the poor to borrow money. Secondly, will this lead to financial bankruptcy and lead to bailouts? Are you kidding me? Poor people go bankrupt over 10,000, 20,000 ringgit, right? You need 100,000 of them to even amount to 1 billion. Last I checked, that's how much Maybank spends on dry cleaning alone, right? We tell you, for people who really crash the economy, those are your big financial institutions, your big financial players who borrow trillions of dollars to crash the economy using CDO. We tell you, Trump went bankrupt 9 times, each time costing the millions of dollars, and yet we still allow him to do business. If they really want to save the economy, they should really ban big banks from getting business, right? We tell you there's also less need to get bailouts now. Because after the 2008 financial crisis, a lot of European banks and US banks are forced to diversify their assets, have insurance on their liability. So we think that the government cannot debate on 2011 context, right? Now, firstly, why exactly they need loans to do well and live themselves out of poverty? Let's talk about the poverty trap, right? Essentially, government wants them to rent for the rest of their life. Here's why it's not worth it, right? When you rent, you are renting from someone who used your money to pay back their mortgage and additional profit on top of that. You are paying all those money without even getting anything in return. When you buy low and cheap goods, you buy a Xiaomi phone, right? It breaks quite frequent. If you buy shoes, cheap shoes, it will break down as opposed to a durable shoe that will allow you to save money in the long run. When they disallow poor people to get money to buy those things that is investment in their life, we tell you it's much worse for them. When they don't have fridges, they have to always buy food and the food will go bad and they will always need to continuously buy things to sustain themselves. Secondly, they can't pay for education, right? In their world, they want those people to save up for 20 years, then only then you can go to Mara, only then you can go to TAR to get some education. In our world, we allow them to get the education first, use your increased income to pay back those loans. Let's talk about logistics and job applications, right? Sometimes you need transportation to access job opportunities that are far away from your home, places that public transport can't access to. In their world, those people need to walk to their workplaces or use a bike to the workplaces. They substantially limit the amount of jobs that these people are able to get. Lastly, business capital. A lot of poor individuals, they have some capital to set up stores in like maybe the Pasar Malam to earn some side income with a view to become their own boss at the end of the day, right? They need some capital to do that, right? In Gulf world, they'll always be forced to work for someone else, and it's always dispensable because they refuse to let them get the capital to own their own businesses. Before that, yes.
Right. So I'm not saying that people can, but literally, I don't know anyone that's as prudent as you paint in this debate. Why is it the case that you're not going to get spending on excess?
I know you cannot say I don't know anyone because I know a lot of people who are prudent, right? If you argue that, I'll just argue the other way. Okay, and also through observation alone, most of the people who live in your Vista Angkasa Puri, you think they buy their apartments with cash, is it? All those people, they take loans, and those are the examples that I will base my debate on today. Now, lastly, why poor people can make the rational choice and take the risk to be bankrupt? We think poor people are not less rational than rich people, right? We tell you poverty is not their fault. Oftentimes they are very frugal, they take on a lot of jobs and a lot of responsibilities. We tell you a lot of times they also take small loans, like to buy a Proton, to buy a house. We don't see why exactly the rich people who are just as rational can buy Maserati, invest in Bitcoin and high-risk stocks, but you don't allow poor people to make loans on a much smaller scale, like buying a small house, buying a small Proton. We think to the extent that OG didn't argue that they were less rational, there's no basis to discriminate against them. But secondly, even if living the good life is what they want and they think it's worth the risk, it's worth it, right? let them do it. Why? Because government doesn't stop you if government thinks you are rational enough from playing extreme sports, right? Or to take unprofitable degrees. If I want to do art instead of law, the government will say you are poor, you can't take art. The government allows you because the government sees that you are rational. We think poor people are exactly just as rational. But lastly, bankruptcy is not so bad, right? With the new Bankruptcy Act, there's increased threshold of bankruptcy. Now banks can't foreclose on your home. They can't foreclose on your car to the extent that your family is dependent on you, right? Employers cannot discriminate you just because of your bad credit rating. And we have tribunals that are very accessible and very cheap in order for them to pursue that. But lastly, government and banks often have an incentive to help you restructure your debt. Why? It's not profitable for the bank for you to just remain on the red ink on the book forever. They want some money back and they're willing to compromise, which is why, given that we prove to you that poor people are not less rational, we think that the risk to live a good life or to succeed in business is a risk that they're willing to they're able to take, and we will allow them to do so in our world to lift themselves out of poverty.
Ready? Actually, should I use this?
Your choice, bro. You do what you want to do.
Never mind. The most confusing part of prep time was me asking Mitrun, what's the national average? Is it 1,000? Is it 3,000? Is it 4,000? And I think I'll blame OG for this. They never tell us what the example is, right? So for the purpose of this speech, I will say the national average is 1,000. Let's make it clear. I think I'm going to talk about, closing government, going to talk about 4 things today, which extension side, they look quite new. The first thing we'll talk about is how we change the financial mindset of millennials now. Secondly, we'll talk about the pursuit of happiness of people in the lower income bracket and why that needs to change. Thirdly, we'll talk about why the shifting of the burden from the government to banks only happens under your side. Lastly, I'll talk about the way we change banks and how they operate. But firstly, I think I just want to get this out of the way, that you simply can't regulate the way that banks, because their solution to banks being predatory is to say that, we can just regulate them. And that's not true, because if you regulate them and the bank has less money to make from it, the bank literally isn't going to give the loan to these people. And all of the opening opposition benefits about, loans being good and helping them buy property, all of that don't materialize, because if you regulate it, you have less of it, right? So banks now are going to decline your loans to people who can't pay them off. Let's talk about the 4 things that we think are new. 1, the financial mindset of millennials and why that has to change. The current millennial mindset has the wrong mindset. And I think opening government alludes to this by saying that they want to buy property and want to buy things instead of renting it. The problem here, you see, isn't with all millennials, but rather we think in this debate, the context and the nuance which closing government position ourselves is your capability to do so. So for instance, if I earn 1,000, actually I get 1,000 a month, so I technically qualify as a low income. So if I get 1,000 ringgit a month and I want to buy a car, right? Maximum banks allows a third of that. So this is the same for everybody, but the problem with this is that I need to pay off a third of my salary every month for like 10 years. And the problem in this context is that poor people simply, A, don't have the savings in terms of what happens during an emergency, or B, don't have a lot of disposable income to begin with. So we're not, against people buying. We don't want to force everyone to rent stuff. We think the capability of you has to be taken into account. But the next more important thing is that the mindset that millennials have is literally the mindset that feeds into the property market. Everybody's saying that you need to get a house, you need to get a you need to get a house, means that property prices necessarily increase super high, right? Things like hype, baller, hype, all these kinds of things. It's a basic supply and demand problem. At the point in which millennials always want to buy instead of rent, it's also the point in which the prices become extremely jacked up and inaccessible. We think that's bad. But the second thing that opening opposition claims is that these loans can help them. Let's deal with them a bit. Because all of these things you're talking about are expenditures. They're not investments, When we talk about the financial mindset under closing gov, we'd rather put your money somewhere it can grow. Put it in a real estate unit trust. Put it in a trust. Invest in stocks and shares. All these sorts of things literally grow your money over time. You can put it in the bank. Put it in the bank, it will grow, right? In comparison, if you buy a laptop, if you buy an iPhone, if you buy a phone, if you buy a car, all these sorts of things are literally things which drain your expenses and cost you more expenses over time. Instead of being frugal, I don't think Leroy's friends are very smart. The second thing to note is, if you earn 1,000 ringgit a month and you're as poor as this debate necessitates you to be, you can't buy a good piece of property. Your property is going to be like 200,000, right? 50,000. This sort of property don't go up in price over time. We think the rate at which they go up is a lot lesser than the average rate of return when you play stocks and shares. So we think the financial mindset has to be encouraged for people to be more financially literate and put the money where it works. No thanks. The third thing to note is that often the giving of mortgages, loans, credit cards, all these sorts of things, we're not going to demonize poor people and say, they're bad spenders. We think there exists a temptation to overspend due to the concept of hyperbolic discounting, right? A poor person is less likely to spend on things that he can't afford if he doesn't have a credit card. So we're not saying that he's not rational. We're saying that the unfortunate act of targeted advertising towards poor people and the creation of capitalistic dreams of what happiness is what's going to make them fall. Secondly, let's talk about the pursuit of happiness and why it's important after this. So we have sold the ideal of a millennial dream, right? We need a good property. We need a good car. And all of these work when property agents, what's the word? They pakat with the bank. And then they say, oh, you need this, we'll give you discount, we'll give you interest on the loan. The problem here and what closing government stands for is we'd rather poor people not base their happiness on material possessions, right? Here's the crucial difference in status quo. If you can't afford anything in the status quo, there's always an alternative, right? You can't afford, and Al Shabus like me, you go past Chichong Kai, you can buy one for 20 bucks. You happy, I'm happy also. Right. What happens in a capitalistic world? If you don't meet the requirement, if you don't have a car, if you don't have a house, you are a failed millennial. You have not achieved or lived the dream yet, right? We think this needs to shift. If you are poor, you find your happiness in your gardenia, your Kit Kat, your Maggie Mee. We think that mindset needs to happen, right? People need to find cheaper source of happiness if you can't afford it. I'll take opening.
Okay, so if your idea is that all these narratives about a good life properties already exist, just because you ban these, why does that narrative work? Isn't it more likely people switch to other dodgier alternatives that I've already said is unregulated compared to a financial institution?
Okay, the report of that is A, when it comes to spending huge amounts of money, people don't go to shark loans to get a car or a house because the lack of a legal contract, like if you get screwed over, you can't get anything. So there's already an incentive not to do that. But the second reason is literally what I'm saying, right? If you can't afford a car, find happiness in Grab. Like you talk to the driver every morning, compliment him on his fragrance, find some other form of happiness. Like if you can't afford Astro, you pay $4 a month, you play Spotify also can. They want got music. Thirdly, let's talk about why it's important under our side that poor people start to lobby. Because under your side, you shift the burden to the banks. When you say that when opening opposition claims that credit is a way out of poverty, it is also a shifting of the burden from the state. We'd rather people not have access to credit. We'd rather have people struggle to put the meals on the table. We'd rather people struggle and be poor, because that is the point in which they'll feel the pinch of being poor. That is the point at which they are more likely to lobby. Because the political lobbying that we want to talk about is very little. Political activism is low, political lifespan, and we'd rather people join in rallies and get more critical mass when it comes to pressuring the government. If being poor is not your fault, you shouldn't have to pay for it. We think states should. If you can't afford a house, the state should provide you with scholarships. Your state should provide you with low cost or even free housing with affordable rent. We think all those are responsibilities of the state. It is not on you to find a cheap house that you can rent and survive in every month. Lastly, let's talk about changing the way banks operate. We think banks earn the most from people who can't afford to pay back, because that's when the interest accumulates over time and they earn a lot of money. In the point in which the banks lose access to the lowest common denominator, there's also a point in which the banks have an incentive to lobby for better policies. This means better schools, better minimum wages, all of which means banks are now bringing their huge political lobbying to campaign in order for poor people to have access to better minimum wages, because there's a market to be exploited, because they now have an interest in getting people out of poverty so they can exploit them. We think closing government changes the way people think in terms of finance. Thank you.
I'd like to invite the second extension speaker.
Yeah. Okay. Terence? Okay. Unfortunately for the closing government in this debate, the world that we live in is a world in which poor people are faced with a desperate choice. If there was free education, houses were on demand, everyone had a house, we wouldn't need this model because poor people wouldn't take loans. Taking up a loan is a high burden that people take, not because they want to and they just want an iPhone, but because we have literally no alternative in the status quo. The second problem with this debate is I think this debate has been too narrow in an assessment of how people are going to spend money, what that means for them. We think rather this debate is about two things. First, an assessment of how people spend their money, correct, but rather more importantly, how communities react to their spending. But we think communities will restructure to be less inclusive of poor people, and therefore, independent of how they spend, communities will be more harmful in the creation of poverty. That's where closing will enter this debate. Before I go into anything, let's take out this closing government nonsense. First thing they say is, look, we need to change the way millennials spend money because people think that houses are worth a lot, but actually you don't get high amounts of return. Like, maybe that might be true, but I think property prices increase because there's a little scarcity in terms of houses. But second, having a house means you're literally geographically positioned in that area. You're a viable voting candidate. You're more likely to be invested within the area. People take more incentive to incorporate into a community, things you wouldn't have. But second, in your world where developers literally know that poor people cannot buy houses, they will skyrocket price of the rent, right? Because everyone is literally coerced into renting houses. In your world, rent prices will be insurmountably higher. Guess what you're going to do? Good luck with dealing with the millennials in that instance. But second, is this material happiness bullshit. Like, the first thing I'm going to say is, in both worlds, material happiness conceptualizes the world as it is. Whether or not you are a poor person or not, the standard of acquiring wealth, how people treat you, like you get a job, will be about material wealth. If it's true in our world, we allow people to access this version in order to escape poverty. We say in principle people should be allowed to do this. In your world, the poor person will still look at someone with a Ferrari and feel shit about themselves, and you don't change that in your world. I don't know how they're going to feel happy from smelling their Uber driver. So I think closing government's just out of this debate. Opening government, I think they're a bit more nicer. So I'm going to interact with them through my argumentation. Right. The first assumption they had was poor people spend really badly. The thing I'm going to say about this, I think opening already did sufficient to prove like, well, they're not that bad, they're actually quite good, is to suggest what's the alternative. In your world where poor people have to wait for long periods of money to collect wealth to buy this iPhone, in your world, they'll wait long periods, have no development in the process, and then buy the iPhone, and that would be the end and the be all and end all. At least in our world, this is the worst case comparative. In our world, poor people who spend really shit amounts, they will take a loan for education, or they'll take a loan to purchase those shitty things maybe, and then they have excess money to spend on things that are actually important. So even if the hierarchy is I care about my iPhone most, in a world in which you have more capital, you can have the iPhone, you can have education. In your world where they pick and choose, and by your logic, if they're really shit moral actors, then they will just buy the iPhone and nothing else. We say more capital is definitely better, even if they're shitty spenders. Second, they say financial institutions are inherently evil. Like, I'm going to agree with the debate. Regulations are absolutely shit. I don't know what the opening opposition is talking about. Regulations are bad. Here's a structural incentive for why banks don't have an incentive to screw over them. The first thing we will suggest, it is complete bullshit to suggest you can get away with screwing over poor people. Competitive banking means that if you don't provide the most fair and the loan market that exists, your competitors will take over this demographic. That's why loans are literally catered to poorer people as a result of this. Second, if you're giving out risky loans and your collateral debt is high in risk, your stock value literally depreciates. People will fire sell them. Your shareholders aren't going to be very, very strongly supportive of your bank. This means a structural incentive not to screw over poor people, independent of regulations, because we don't think that is a true thing in this debate. Extension material. Opening opposition is right to suggest that money is an important enabler in escaping poverty. They say you can purchase education. But the problem with the opening is they only suggested you have education and you can buy loans, then you can pay back your debt. It's not just paying debt. We think there are many other things you can do with this education, not just to not be poor, but to actually be part of an important social structure. The first, if you own houses, for example, and you're able to pay a mortgage, you're a permanent resident within the area. You're more likely for politicians to lobby for you, more likely for people to care about your interests. You build communal ties that you wouldn't have access with. You would have more individuals opting and investing into your area because they feel like you're invested within a particular demographic. Second, if you have access to educational loans, for example, it's not just paying back the loan. You literally have skill sets you can take back to your community. You literally have access to data and information you previously didn't have. So we will posit that it's not just paying off the debt opening opposition. It's about literally enabling people to escape the structures that clamp them into poverty. But the second part of my extension is super important. Can you imagine a world in which people knew the poor demographic, these poor individuals, didn't have the money to pay for education? Because it would take a long time to accumulate 40,000 to pay for like an average education degree, right? What will happen? A few things. First, we think developers will have no incentive to incorporate and build low-cost housing within poor areas. The only incentive for developers in the status quo to enter into Kuala Selangor, to develop parts of Brooklyn and like New York, places that are completely desolate. Governments don't give funding. It's because they know poor people can access mortgage, therefore they can purchase my houses. In the model of the opposition bench, these things will be removed. As a result, you will have low investment in FDI that is crucial for poor areas to escape poverty. Second, we think as a result of this, in your world, more and more people opting to renting. Because in your world, renting is predatory, and we now literally have a demographic it's locked. They don't have any other option. Rent prices will be incrementally higher. So in your world, when they have to pay high rent prices, then they take away from education, take away from funding. So you incentivize those two things. But the third, education will restructure to be worse. In a world where education institutions like Taylor's University knew that poor people were never going to come to a university, they won't provide vocational studies. They won't provide things that are mostly catered to poor people. Things like, for example, management of debt, management of social infrastructure. All those courses will be gone because poor people are no longer an important demographic within our system. These things are harmful because why? Even if this poor person cannot pay back the loan, let's assume this worst case is on the gov, is everyone is really like on the verge of bankruptcy. At least in our world, there's a creation of infrastructure that inherently escapes you out of poverty. In their world, this infrastructure will be non-existent. Education and like housing development will always be privy to the richer. Even if you wanted to escape poverty, you couldn't. Yes, Eric.
You can always have rent caps. Why is it better to have someone who is just starting up financially to be stuck stagnantly in the stage that
you see, Eric, that's the problem. Even if you have rent caps, then in your world, literally the capacity of developers to make profit is also limited. Therefore, you feed into the same problem I have, where there's literally no incentive to enter into poorer areas because you make no profit as a result of this. Second, according to the opening opposition, people are short-term. This is super important. I want to talk about poor people for a minute. If you knew you had to wait 45 years, in a lot of cases, if it's $1,000, you have to literally wait 40 months before you can afford the education. A lot of poor people will give up on saving money. They won't save for an education. They will tell themselves, I'll purchase short-term products. I'll buy the cheaper vocational education. I'll buy the shittier quality house. And in that world, you don't incentivize long-term planning in the government world. This is harmful because every time your father tells you you should be a doctor, the father will say, oh, take me 40 months, son, to safe for you might as well be something cheaper. So you literally incentivize poorer people to restructure the way they financially motivate themselves, and they'll pick worse options. They'll pick shorter options. They could have had that education, but because you made the cost of education saving for 30 years, it becomes harder. And every time you want to opt into that access, you make it worse. This debate is about how they spend, but it's more about the way in which communities restructure that is absolutely pervasive to poorer communities.
All right, thank you, Member Bob.
Ready? The unfortunate world that we live in tells us we need to constantly work, earn money, buy more expensive things to feel like marginally better than the other person because that's an arbitrary metric of success, then we die. We think that is the least fulfilling life, and this is the least accessible life for these poor individuals. But what does oftentimes richer people and richer structures do? They throw you a threat. They say, I'll give you money. Why don't you use this money to come on board to this lavish lifestyle, and you can stay here, and we promise you Alice in Wonderland. But oftentimes the thread breaks, and oftentimes people are stuck in purgatory. What was the problem with CEO? They were very express and never necessarily engaged with what Kahong's argument. So I don't know if, like in this debate, philosophical arguments are not a thing, but what is Kahong's argument? When lesser and lesser people within a certain community are unable to access a particular structure or particular luxury, that is no longer considered luxury, that is a necessity. That becomes something that the community can now opt out of. For example, oftentimes tribes within Sarawak don't require education to lead fulfilling lives. So obviously, this is not going to solve everything by tomorrow, right? Like if that is the burden on the op, I'll walk out. But what is it? If we can marginally improve the pursuit of happiness of each individual person, make it much more easier for them to access, not be in a hamster wheel that continues to spin for some rich fat guy, we would prefer the Monopoly man, right? That is what Kahong's argument centered around, and there was no extension to that. But before I move on to more of what Kahong said, a few levels of extraneous rebuttals. This is first Amrit's contention, right? Houses are great, and everyone should buy houses. Two reasons why houses are absolutely the worst. Oftentimes, people from lower communities need to constantly move around because they get better jobs from different people, right? That means for one day, you'll be working Kuala. If the better offer comes in Selangor, you now need to move to Selangor. If the better offer comes from Perak, you now need to move to Perak, right? Those are legitimate things that oftentimes people of the lower economic block need to consider. Houses clamp you down because the ability for you to sell your house is incredibly hard, and you continue to pay the interest and you're no longer able to move into the next place. That is why houses are pernicious. But comparatively, why is rent better, right? We will posit to you that oftentimes there is no regulation on rent. There is no Rent Act, right? There is a Land Act that mandates the house prices are regulated by the government, but oftentimes rent isn't. And also many individuals already own mass amounts of property, and like obviously there will be some level of competition among rent, right? So the knowledge is land is finite, everyone needs land, and people will always buy at a premium price. Comparatively, if you don't give me a cheaper rent, I can move to the next place that will give me a cheaper rent because of the vast amounts of development that Amrit talked about, right? So we think that rent is far better, and we rather people of underprivileged economic blocks do take rent. Secondly, this is OO's few arguments, right? OO said they'll go to loan sharks. Okay, then the solution is now to regulate loan sharks, right? So obviously we cannot account for every single thing that will happen, but we don't think it is mutually exclusive. Loan sharks will happen in either world, but we tell you that on both sides we'll try to regulate it, and we think that it's extraneous to this debate. Sit down. Thirdly, what did Leroy also tell you? Why don't you start a store in Pasar Malam? This is not sensitive to the extension that Kahong brought to you, and also I'll extend, right? Oftentimes startups are more likely to fail. 90% of all startups fail. Why so? Because the economic market in the status quo is extremely competitive, and there are already individuals who make huge amounts of profit because of follow basis. This means that oftentimes people who just join the particular market cannot find sufficient followers to ensure that they get some form of profit to make their debt payments, right? We think startups are the absolute worst within this particular environment. We would rather you work for the man because that guarantees you some level of salary, right? What else did Leroy brilliantly tell you? Leroy told you, don't worry, the bank will help with your debt problems and help it solve you. This basically is the bank will fuck you up and then help you when you are fucked to get out of the fucking, right? But man, the bank don't fuck you up in the first place, right? That is the simple solution that we suggested, right? If banks don't put you in debt, we don't need debt recovery problems, right? So we don't think that argument suffices within this place, right? Lastly, what are the clashes and what are the incentive structures that we would like to argue on? Number one, we will question what will people buy on a balance of probabilities, in which world would this be better?
Secondly, who better changes the pursuit of happiness and why that change is important? Lastly, why on which side would there be more pressure on the governments to change the ways in which they act? Sit down. Firstly, what will people buy? This could be classified to two key things, right? Necessities and flexing things, right? Things like your Supreme underwear because you want to seem richer than the other person. Let's talk about necessities, right? They say that people oftentimes subscribe to studies. There is no guarantee a degree will get you a job. Firstly. Secondly, so oftentimes individuals who do go and get these degrees and do not get the salary required to pay off this debt oftentimes suffer, right? Like there's a huge student debt crisis within countries like America because oftentimes the salary does not make up to the amount of interest the banks have already collected in the status quo in terms of when they give you. Secondly, oftentimes the huge competitive markets mean that people can't afford to give you huge salaries. So this debate in Malaysia, and because of like the horrible economic situation of Malaysia, we don't think it is profitable for someone of the lower economic division to now get a loan to pursue a study and then compete with richer people who oftentimes have connections and their father working in that company or their father's best friend working in that company. We would rather the person take the easier route out and take the next available job because that guarantees him income without a loss. That is a preferable, and we make the trade-off. Secondly, what did Amrit tell you, right? That there will be vast amounts of infrastructure because there exists these people who can now access. We think these infrastructures are all pernicious, right? They sell you this facade that if you access these infrastructures, they guarantee you some level of happiness and some level of success. We think that selling of that idea has screwed over many different people, and statistics actually show this, right? We think that is like detrimental to communities. But let's talk about the flip side, where they actually buy things to like flex, right? We already proved to you why houses are really bad and rent is preferable. But secondly, we told you that in these scenarios, oftentimes because the people have access to these things, like when you get a credit card and you wanted to buy LV because all your friends wear LV, you're more likely going to do it because you think you can pay it off. We think that sort of nature is extremely dangerous. Yeah, go for it, Leroy.
So what type of job do those poor people take then to travel all around the country for those jobs? Most of them stay in one area and use the proportion of their money to pay back the houses they have.
I didn't understand the PR. You want to repeat it? Go for it.
What kind of jobs those poor people take them to travel all across the country to get those jobs?
No, like, it's a different job. Like. One day you work in this McDonald's, right? Suddenly KFC offer you more in Perak, right? You just move to KFC. Like, suddenly Domino's offer you more. You move to Domino's. Like there's the fast food industry, there's the cinema industry. There's so many industries that require you to work without having a degree, right? You can access those jobs because they don't keep you in debt, which perpetually leaves you poor. Secondly, how we change the pursuit of happiness. We think when communities are limited to the access of happiness that is mutually exclusive to the rich, that is when they would reconsider the incentive structures and how they need to live their life. This is an important extension from Kahang. Why? Because the world in which we live in today is extremely pernicious and constantly keeps us depressed, right? Because we will never be able to be rich. We all in this room, right? I'll tell you, right? All of you talk to your friends about us being rich, living in fancy houses and driving really nice cars. Most of us aren't going to achieve this statistically, right? We think if people have more legitimate and more reasonable expectations of what is success, and if we stop giving people the access to stupid things, that'll make the pursuit of happiness better. But lastly, I think Kahang also told you where there's more pressure on the government. In a world in which people are continuously being screwed over, they're more likely to lobby, and that's a preferable world.
Unfortunately, for the most of us in this room, we don't understand what is it like to be poor. What is it like to face a wall or to face the choice of the world that you might never be able to access these options? Like, we don't know. We don't know what is it like to know to feel hunger for the next meal, or to forever feel like I might be hungry for the next 10 years. For a lot of these individuals, they understand the consequences of their purchase. They know it's a one-time offer. They know the difficulty that is involved with this responsibility. But that is not a simple answer to deny them a fundamental right to correct their lives, a fundamental right to correct their family's life, and a fundamental right to correct the people that they care for. I think this debate has three parts. There's a discussion about the institution. I think that's where opening rests their hat on, like by talking that these institutions are extremely predatory and therefore they need to be they need to be prevented from exercising their operation, given that operation comes at the expense of the well-being of people. And then we'll look into a discussion about purchases. And I think there's a bit of discussion that Amrit adds on to it, like what are the types of purchases that have happened, and then this discussion about pursuit of happiness. I promise you, I will be the most comparative. The first thing that opening talks about is that the discussion about this institution. The first thing they claim is that these institutions are just designed to break regulation. Maybe true, but the nature of financial institution is that, like Amrit suggests to you, is not like they beat regulation, but it's not because they're financial in nature. Like the problem in America is because these financial institutions are big. Their size allows them to do things that are extremely predatory. Like because JP Morgan and big banks are so big, they're able to lobby and literally buy out both ours. They're able to do that. The argument is not that financial institutions are predatory. The size sometimes influence it. And like Amrit tells you, like in the Malaysian financial market or whatever, because the size are relatively similar and there's competitive forces that actually regulate for fair pricing and fair practices. That's why in Malaysia, you cannot buy 3 different houses, right, using the same application loan, the small interim period. Like the security commissions or Bank Negara will literally take notice of this. But this wasn't the case in America. Literally, like if you get a bank, if you get a loan from JP Morgan, literally you can get another 2 or 3 loans, buy another addition of houses in America, because that's just how things are created in America. Those are arguments to regulate the banks. Those are not the arguments of financial institution or the right of borrowing. All right, that's the first thing. But the second thing is that they also argue that borrowing leads to economic crisis. I don't think so, right? I already explained to you, there are a lot of structural reasons over borrowing leads to economic crisis. Creation of property market and hiding credit rating agencies leads to economic crisis. So it's not easy. Like, don't allow this opening government to just claim that this economic crisis is largely led by people just purely borrowing. But then here's the best part. Regulations are responsive. I concede, but they are also corrective. The reason why we should allow people to make those choices because preemptively deciding for them is extremely restrictive, and I think it leads to the second part of this debate. So if I'm able to prove that the right to react later is okay and is a trade-off that we should make, it's important in this debate. Now, let's talk about what Amrit talked about in today's debate, because I think, and this is just to delineate our opening, right? Opening did a great job in explaining why your conditions allows you to warrant these loans. That is less relevant to today's debate. If you are able to show the loan that you get and the way you wish you act on those loans allows you to liberate your choices, these are already good things. And Amrit already tells you that very often your spending pattern in acquiring capital or reacting, if you have capital, access to capital, means there are a lot of political benefits of doing so. What does it mean? It means that because very often the access to capital means that people will be able to predict and make choices around those behaviors. This is what Amrit explained. Does a great deal of job in saying that a lot of structural discriminatory practices are more likely going to be signaled as a result of people. If I can just predict, people won't have capital. Hear me out here. Like, you don't know the amount of discrimination that an immigrant faces in this country. You know why? Because a lot of employers understand that you have nowhere to go. There are houses that you cannot enter. They are underpaid. The types of job they get is terrible. The type of housing they get is terrible. I'll get to this rent cap in a bit. Therefore, it leads to very structural practices. Once you realize that there's literally no escape, this is the destiny that you're doomed to live with. Although I know opening government explained that, even closing government explained that, there's rent caps, guys, it problem solved. No, for people who are desperate, they're more likely going to close one eye. Like a lot of students, they stay in pretty shady accommodation, sharing multiple rooms in small areas because they have literally no choice. Therefore, shortage means that people will close one eye or more likely just admit themselves to very bad condition. And I'm going to explain to you the rent that is accrued from individuals on the ground. This is just problematic. That means that people are more likely going to incur costs justly because of a state engineer. Yes.
Financial agencies check up on credit agencies and they say this is a good bet and you give a large amount of property to someone who can afford it. That's how you get your economic crisis, and these people will always be bailed out.
No, I don't think